Good morning. Thank you all very much for coming. What we are going to discuss today are the Indian politics, the economy, financial markets, what is in store for investors. And we have usually found this discussion even from last year to have lots of questions from the audience and being able to answer the questions, spend more time on Q&A rather than enjoying our own spiel and talking to you for a long period of time. With that in mind, we will probably speak just for about 3 minutes each in terms of introductory remarks. So you see where the panelists come from and spend practically all of the rest of the time responding to your questions. So I hope you will not be bashful. You'll have lots of questions, otherwise we may end a bit too early. And also this panel is a lead-in for an Asia summit that the Milken Institute is going to have on September 18th and 19th, where we'll be discussing a lot of Asian countries, India inclusive. So I hope some of you would be able to participate in that as well. To my far right is Sam Gupta, who is going to be the person initially talking about where he sees the opportunities in the market, especially as we look at the elections, election-related euphoria, to what extent they are justified and what the outlook is following the elections. And he, in turn, is going to discuss both the political and, to some extent, the economic side post-elections. Sanjay Patel, immediately to my right, will be the next speaker. And he, in turn, will be speaking in terms of the opportunities from a macro perspective as an investor as to why the elections do matter today and how the investors are likely to react, again being an on-the-ground investor. Manjeet Singh, immediately to my left, is the person who will in turn be talking in terms of what the challenges are facing the Indian consumer and various other areas today. In terms of the qualifications, all the panelists are extremely well qualified. I won't go into detailed description, but Sam to my far right is the CEO and Chief Investment Officer of Grand Trunk Capital Management in Palo Alto, with a lot of on-the-ground investments in India and recent discussions with members of different parties. And Sanjay Patel, in turn, is not only the head of Europe for Apollo, but in addition runs the private equity business and runs an office in India, so you can ask him a lot of questions on what he faces. Manjeet is president of Sony Pictures Home Entertainment, but until very recently lived and worked in India as the head of the Mumbai office. So he again has faced the challenges of the investor firsthand. So why don't we start with you, Sam? And the questions I would pose for you would be, there seems to be everything is Narendra Modi and elections. I say Narendra Modi is probably the new synonym for nirvana. Everything, all your problems are going to be taken care of. And does that make sense? And how do you, again, as an investor, react to all of that?
You make it sound like a recreational drug. So, India is going through the largest election the world's ever known. 850 million voters, and what's really fascinating this time is about 450 out of a million voters out of those are below 35. And so this is really an election about change. It's about youth wanting jobs, wanting electricity, wanting infrastructure. The results, it's an election that's over 6 weeks. Results come out May 16th. And really this election is about change. I have never seen the kind of intensity in terms of people's expectations, anti-incumbency. So what's happened is we think from our perspective, if the current opinion polls are true, that a new government would be, well, a new government is going to be sworn in anyway, but a somewhat more pro-business, pro-reform government will be sworn in May 16th. Having said that, within the financial market, there's been an expectation of this, and of course, markets have done well. India is one of the best performing markets year to date. And one has to be a bit cautious because opinion polls in the past, they're always off. And especially in a country like India where you have millions of voters, a sample size of 3,000, and you have 3 million people voting in a constituency, sometimes you get it off. So there is that level of uncertainty. But I really, what I want to talk about most is that, like, let's assume the current market predicted scenario does happen. What happens afterwards when you do have a new government that comes in and deals with all the accumulated economic issues that have not been dealt with for the past 3 to 4 years? And really, that's something I think we should talk more today. But I think there's tremendous opportunity for the patient investor if you see the government making the right moves. And there's some low-hanging fruit. There's some very tough economic decision and political decisions they have to take. So in my view, it remains to be seen the composition of the government. Whatever we say today, I think after May 16th, things will change one way or the other. I don't subscribe to the view that the market has factored all the good news, because once the new government does come into place, there are significant opportunities. There are assets that are very cheap, and if there's a clear path for these industries and these areas to move, one can do tremendously well. So just
Thank you, Sam. And I particularly liked your reference to the low-hanging fruit and the other fruits. So perhaps in the subsequent discussion, you can talk about what some of those sectors are.
Sure.
I think for our audience, it would be good to know how you approach them.
Sure.
Sanjay, perhaps in terms of you're heading the Indian operations, your private equity firm operations there. Do you share in all of the euphoria? How do you see the situation, let's say, for the next 2 to 5 years, not just as a result of the post-elections?
Great, thanks, Kamal. Great to be here again. I'd say that euphoria and despair, the two words that tend to be used a lot with India, which gives you a sense of the cyclicality of the mood towards the country. And I will notice that this panel I've been on for a while, I think we started off in a much bigger room, and it's been shrinking, shrinking every year. However, actually, from our point of view, as a contrarian investor, I actually think this is good. I actually think that in some ways, you know, there's been a lot of discussion here about Africa, China, and you know, look, these are big economies, great potential. Look, we think India has great potential still, and we'll talk a lot about it today. And we've built a business there. And the key thing that Kamal said, which I think for us is important, is we're really a long-term investor. So from a 3 to 5 year perspective, you've got to take a view. The market view or the public market view certainly can give you a specific view on what people feel about what's going on today. You know, and it's a near-term view, but a long-term view gives you a different perspective. And so from a secular point of view, we still believe, you know, it's amazing how many young people there are in India, the demographic growth of the country. The demography is a huge driver of consumption, will be for the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years. And therefore there's, you know, latent consumer demand, which we think drives a lot of the growth in the country. And, you know, there's certainly between 2008, 2009 and today, the statistics that we see paint a very negative picture, because everything's down. Growth's down, the car sales are down, you know, the banks have higher NPL ratios, but in our judgment, it's all fixable, because fundamentally there's nothing wrong. It's a little bit like the US in the sense that there's a political paralysis. However, when we get into the details, on the macro side, the country is actually in pretty good shape. And we think India is in better shape from a fiscal point of view than a lot of other emerging markets. And frankly, when tapering occurs, we think, and we should talk about it, we think India is better positioned. The issue is paralysis. It's government paralysis. So looking through all of that, you know, we think at the end of the day, India is a great bet if you buy right. Look, at the end of the day, at Apollo, we talk about being a value investor and a contrarian investor. We think actually when there's dislocation in India, that's exactly when you should be buying India, if you believe in the long-term view, and which we do. And I think that dislocation, although the markets have moved up a little bit in anticipation of May 16th, there's a tremendous amount of dislocation still on the ground. And that's, in some ways, creating great investment opportunities, in our view. So we've actually been leaning in to the country over the last 12 months. We hope to lean in more. Frankly, oddly, the more euphoria there is, I think the worse it is for us. I think there'll be fewer great investment opportunities. But we still believe there's enough paralysis, and it'll take some time for the new government to deal with the paralysis that's been created over the last 5 years, that we think there's a runway to make continued good investments, on the ground in the country.
Great. Thank you, Sanjay. I particularly liked your focus on the long term. This is a country with a long, long history going back thousands of years. And still, I think your reference to the demographic factor, I think, is very apt. The average Indian today is 26 years old, the median age. 5% of the Indians are more than 65 years old. In China, it is 12%. And those demographics are very important, that it's a very young population despite being a very old country. Right. Manjeet, you've lived and worked in India before you came on to your present position at Sony here in Los Angeles. What we heard from Sam and Sanjay resonate with you, or is it actually living and working? Is it more of a challenge for you on the business side?
A little different. So I'm going to agree with Sanjay and then disagree with Sanjay. I have always been very bullish about India and the opportunity that India presents. And really there are three reasons. One is what we've already referred to as the human capital in India. Whatever statistic you look at, 55% of the country is below the age of 25. 75% of the country is below the age of 35. It's one of the youngest populations in the world. It's a highly educated population. We put out more engineers than almost any other country in the world. You can look at the results of those efforts. If you look at Silicon Valley, you'll see about 40% of the companies are headed by Indians. So the human capital is a great strength that India has. The second thing that India is all kinds of little micro markets. Every little town is its own micro market, and they're quite independent and work as micro markets. So unlike China, where 30% of the GDP is reliant on exports, in India it's closer to 10%. So what happens in the rest of the world doesn't impact India, and India has the opportunity and the size to continue to grow because it is a consumption market because of these young people. And the third reason is that I would give is just talking from a Sony perspective. Our electronics business and our network business, these are the most profitable operations globally for us, and they're out of India. And this has all happened in the last, in the case of networks, 5 years, in the case of our electronics business in the last 10 years. So we've seen tremendous benefit and can testify to the strength of India. However, we are entering into an election, and the results are going to be out on May 16th. But it's going to be very crucial that the next government that comes in really focuses on the key issue that confronts India, and that is the infrastructure has collapsed. We are choking on ourselves. I listened to Bob Iger yesterday talk about saying that there are 325 million people who can come in 3 hours by high-speed trains to the Disney theme park in Shanghai. I can't get across some days from one side of Bombay to the other in 3 hours. And that's 20 million people. The country is dying. And if the new government, whoever they be, or whatever shape it takes, does not invest in infrastructure, we will have nobody in the room in 5 years because India will be irrelevant. It will be completely irrelevant. It is absolutely critical that we move away from what has been done, and for good reason, which was feeding the people fish, to actually teaching them how to fish by giving them the infrastructure. So the next government has huge challenges. It doesn't have the capital because in the good times we squandered away a lot of our capital on projects that probably weren't worthwhile. And the next government is going to have to raise resources globally to bring in a investment infrastructure the kind that China has today. And that is really the challenge that India faces. And if it isn't addressed almost immediately, the story of India is over.
Manjeet, thank you very much. I think that was a great introduction. because it's not the intention of the panel to sugarcoat the issues here and come out with all of euphoria. So I hope you have equally skeptical questions as Manjeet expressed in terms of the problems about infrastructure and the need to deal with them urgently. We are ready for your questions, but if you want to think for a minute or two, I can begin with, sir, the gentleman here, but please wait for the gentleman to give you a microphone. And identify yourself, please.
Sure. My name is Wasim Aburjaili. I work at Peridium Global Investors. We are a macro hedge fund, mostly FX and rates and credit. I'd like to pick up on your last point, sir, in terms of the infrastructure. And my understanding that India needs roughly, and I could be off, you guys correct me, but like $500 billion in investment to upgrade its, over years, to upgrade its infrastructure. So how is India eventually going to be able to attract that kind of capital? And second, my second point is that, obviously with Modi and, with all the euphoria and, whether they get majority or they don't get a majority to push their various agendas, what will it change? Are they able to actually execute on their agenda, or is the political system too complex for them to be able to, make the tough choices and move forward? So how to attract capital, and how is the political system eventually be able to, assuming supermajority in the parliament and all of that?
Yeah, and I'm not sure.
Great questions. Thank you.
The bookies are betting that they'll get about 220 seats, which is not an absolute majority, but it's close, which means they will form the government. The hope that the new government brings is that Narendra Modi has invested in infrastructure in the state that he currently runs, which is Gujarat. And that state is visibly different from other parts of India where there are decent roads, there is power 24/7 and things like that. So the hope is that he can spread that. But you're right, the investment size is so huge that the national government at this point doesn't have the resources. So it will have to be a combination of privatizing and bringing in private resources globally, as well as leading the way with some government key infrastructure projects. And the government has shown it can do it. The metro system in Delhi is state of the art. It's as good as anything you see anywhere in the world. So when the will is there and the government moves, it has actually been able to progress these infrastructure projects. There have been setbacks when they've done things retroactively and changed laws and things like that that scare investors, and all that has to be addressed by the new parliament.
Just on on infrastructure, I was one of a core group of investors that helped build the New Delhi airport and the Mumbai airport. So if you go to Mumbai now, the brand new airport is world class, and it was built on, and although that one was delayed by a few months, the one in New Delhi was built under budget, and it was ready 3 months before it was supposed to. So to Manjeet's point, things can be done. The figure of $500 billion, $1 trillion, that doesn't bother me. That's, if you create an environment where you can have investors, then the money is very fungible. It's not an issue. And if you look at it, India has significant domestic savings even today. But right now, if you're a typical household, what do you invest in? You invest in real estate. You buy gold. Indians have $1 trillion worth of gold. You put money under the mattress, and then you might think of going to the bank and putting deposits. Even then, the deposit growth in the last 10 years has been 10x in the banking system. So in terms of the capital requirement, that's very fungible. I don't think that's an issue. But you have to create a regulatory and a financial environment so that these projects are able to take off. Part of that means a corporate bond market that does not exist. So if you look at a power plant, how do you build a power plant? I mean, if you have to go to a bank and get a 10-year loan, no bank will give you a 10-year loan. So you need to be able to issue bonds, and that's something that they don't have. So, you guys are out there and you're looking at all these different opportunities, and we are. If you don't have a corporate bond market, it is very tough to do infrastructure. So it's really about creating a environment, a regulatory and a financial environment where people feel safe that their investment's taken care of. And just last thing in terms of can it be done? Absolutely. It really is not rocket science. The single biggest issue that you have is actually land acquisition, which we can talk about. Everything else is low-hanging fruit. I mean, you know, we're being somewhat facetious. We joke about it. It's, you know, 2 hours worth of decision making in terms of the big picture. But land acquisition in India is your single biggest issue for infrastructure. So again, going back to Manjit's point, if you look at Gujarat, the state that the would-be PM is from, they've actually done a fantastic job. They have 2 of the largest ports in India. They're as efficient as anywhere else. They have excellent roads. They have 24/7 energy. It's all doable if you have a political will and somebody that can take decisions.
Thank you, Sam.
I'd say
Sanjay,
just quickly, the manifesto says we're going to do it. So the actual manifesto. A number of these require state approval, and a lot of projects that have been stalled on the infrastructure and on the industrial side have been stalled because of state issues. So one question is, can the center really influence the state? Because literally 65% of the issues are actually at the state level, but the center has to be powerful. So the majority and the extent of the majority does determine some of these outcomes. So 220 versus 270, that's a big difference. And you know, there are multiple scenarios as to how, what we think as an investor, because you could be in a state of majority, or you might be in kind of in this interim coalition state. The issue, at the end of the day, I kind of agree with everyone. Infrastructure is the biggest issue. Power, roads, but also healthcare and education. And we'll talk about that. I think that those are massive issues because the demography is creating dramatic need for colleges, universities. So it is all about infrastructure. Look, we're in between some of the largest pools of capital in the world, looking for opportunities in the world. In a world where you're not getting any yield. Okay, there's no return anywhere in the world. And India affords, to some extent, government rates at 9%, people borrow at 15%. You know, so I think a lot of capital pools.
Corporate ROEs are in high teens.
And corporate ROEs in the high teens. So on a valuation basis, on a return basis, a lot of pools are saying, should I be in infrastructure? Right. You know, so we've had these conversations. Can you generate a very high rate of return? And do you believe in power purchase agreements? Do you believe that the government in toll roads will give you the returns you need? You know, these are big questions, but I'd say there is a lot of capital around the world looking for high returns. This could be an area of attractive return, but again, a lot of execution risk, etc. So look, I think it's a fair question, but I think it's not going to happen overnight.
Thank you. The gentleman in the first row.
I've got a question on investment regulation related to the agriculture in India. For a country to invest in order to achieve food security, how India regulations are relaxed with the investment into agriculture, and how it is compared with Africa today, being one of the potential countries for investment to achieve food security.
So you know, India is the largest producer of fruits and vegetables in the world. One of the largest producers of grains. The tragedy is not agriculture. The tragedy is what happens when you harvest. 50% of the food is wasted because lack of infrastructure, a supply chain, you know, food storage facilities. So if I were to, you know, prioritize, to me, food processing and food storage is significantly more important than, frankly, agriculture in terms of investment. I do not see, regardless of which government comes in power, any relaxation in terms of investors coming and buying agricultural land, because it is a very sensitive, emotional topic. 75% of the population in India relies on farming. And again, I also don't think at a macro level, it is an imperative. If you just fix the supply chain and instead of wasting 50% of the food, waste perhaps 20%, that's a sea change right there. And this also touches to something that we'll talk later. You know, inflation's been a very tough issue in India because, frankly, it's one of the most supply-constrained market. You know, we all sit here and we know there's demand. If you can make it and you can get it out at a reasonable price, somebody will buy it. But it's a supply-constrained market, and inflation's really been caused by food prices. simply because half the food is wasted. So this is a very crucial question, but I personally don't think it's about, having massive farms. First step is at least let's preserve what you grow.
Thank you.
I was going to say something. Just the irony of what happened in the last 4 years is that there was a huge focus on rural employment to benefit the farmers. And so the government created a big deficit by, in effect, guaranteeing rural employment. And then at the same time, you had high inflation. So everyone's wages were wasted. And so part of the election will be, 75% of India is still agricultural. Those people vote. They're going to vote with their pocketbook, and we'll see.
We'll see. Just a little statistic I'll throw out. Somebody did a study, just came out 3 days ago. They're spending about $10 to $12 billion in rural areas to, in essence, provide food subsidies. And the math is that they could just do $3 billion a year in micro irrigation technologies. Those farms, their actual incomes will go up 35%, and they don't need to provide that subsidy. So this is the sheer stupidity of decision making that happens there, where they're happy to give, because then somebody say, I gave you food. But back to your fish analogy, teaching somebody to fish.
Sam, that also goes to the point that the Brits may have invented bureaucracy, but the Indians certainly made it worse.
No, I would say
perfected it.
They perfected it.
Perfected it. The gentleman in the first row.
Thanks. This is great. A great panel. So it clearly comes down to the fact that, bad government can kill anything, right? So I want to talk about another aspect, or ask about another aspect of the government, and that's the BJP. And, Mussolini was well known for making the trains run on time, but at the end of the day, his legacy wasn't so great because of, his politics. The jingoistic, racialist, and highly parochial, and that's probably putting it mildly for some of the extreme parts of the BJP. That seems to me kind of an elephant in the room, and it's being put in the background now and for purposes of the election. But when that comes out, which it probably inevitably will, particularly if they get a large majority, what's that going to mean for stability in India? And I don't see that as political instability or riots of, being a great background for an investment environment.
Yeah. That's a great question. And again, for the rest of you in the audience, the reason the question becomes very relevant is that there were riots in the state of Gujarat in 2002 when Mr. Modi was the chief minister, as he is today as well. And the Hindu-Muslim clash was one of the worst in post-independent history. And the question is, will a Hindu chief minister who was there doing that, will he still be able to deal with this country? And I'm going to pose to the panelists another question alongside yours, sir, and that is, what happens if hostilities break out with Pakistan, for instance, and then will his motivations be very suspect as a result of that, even if he tries to be a good prime minister and to deal with good relationship with Pakistan? So hopefully, all of us are very involved. So would you like to start us off, Manjeet?
Sure. I think it's there's certainly elements of the BJP, as in any party, that are very extreme, and if they were ruling the country, that would be problematic. But the fact is, you have to govern the country, and the country, we have 150 million Muslims that can't be ignored. And so, the fear, I think, of having someone come in with the background from Gujarat is less so at the national level. So I don't see that as much of an issue. I think people recognize that also it will be a coalition, so there will be a need to put some sort of support together. So the governance will be tempered, and we don't see that as an issue. And on Pakistan, I think India is quite over Pakistan. We're really quite over it. It's fine.
Yeah. Look, I think it's not India is not a dictatorship. It's never been. So it is a democracy. I think it's a very complex democracy. And look, all the parties, including the Congress party, have been, through the Sikh massacre, post Indira Gandhi's. Look, that Congress was there, and they basically allowed the Sikhs to be killed in Delhi when she was, assassinated by her Sikh bodyguards. Remember, it was
The
riots.
the death toll was 6 times that of.
The death toll was 6 times.
Of
The
that
Congress
was
was
in
in
Gujarat.
charge. And so, Sonia and Rajiv and all of them were in charge. And so it's crazy, but it's been happening for a long time, and both sides. So I think, Modi is a complex guy, and there's no doubt about it. I think, but he's got to, obviously live with what happened. I think you got to balance it out. So it's a little bit of an elephant in the room, but I think if you're in India, if you talk, I don't live that day to day, but if you talk to people, people have very mixed views about this, and so that's one thing. I'd say the only other thing I'd say about the about the situation is there's no doubt that he is going to be he is a tough guy. He's very simple. I think he has a simple agenda. He's not a complex guy. And I think what you see is what you get. And so I think that's got good things about it and maybe not. So there is tail risk. I can't deny that there's tail risk about the whole thing.
Sanjay, I liked your reference to the Indira Gandhi assassination by the Sikh bodyguards. People think of everything as Modi in 2002, but they forget that there were other incidents, and the Congress party was ruling when that happened as well.
Well, if you look at just recent history, so first of all, I personally feel the Indian English media, which, by the way, if you look at the ownership, primarily is owned by the Congress party. And the Western media feeds significantly off that. So if you look in there was frankly, an absurd article in The Economist advocating Rahul Gandhi, who really melted down on his only TV interview as the prime minister. It was absurd. But I do think it's overblown. In Gujarat, you've not had a single incident after 2002. Since then, you've had 150 riots in India in different states, primarily in Congress-ruled states, where again, if you take the death toll, which I know it's a very crude way of equalizing it, it's multiple of what's happened. So we find, as somebody who follows this on a daily basis, the media coverage has frankly been very one-sided in a way. Secondly, going back to what any party does anywhere in the world, I mean, you take the Republicans or the Democrats here in their primaries, you go to your base, and then in the major election, you run to the center. And when you actually govern, then you have to deal with the realities. Then you have to really make the sausage. In this case, nobody in India who's a prime minister can, first of all, as he said, it's not a dictatorship. There are so many constitutional checks across the board, in fact, too many. And that, by the way, will slow down his development agenda. That's the reason you cannot go, like in Shanghai, you can say, okay, we don't want Pudong here tomorrow, we want a business district. You cannot do it in India. Just cannot. Same way you cannot create a culture of fascism. So like the Mussolini example, I mean, I really beg to differ. It just is not appropriate at all here. Because you are in a system which is much bigger than any party. Now, mind you, if you look at India's, in a way, the best business reform process as well as stability was between 1999 and 2004. BJP was a party in power. They were the ones who opened up the peace dialogue with Pakistan. That was the closest India and Pakistan came to doing a deal. That was also the time in Kashmir, which is one area where there's significant issues. They had a very peaceful dialogue. In fact, the current chief minister of Kashmir was the junior foreign minister in the BJP government. So will there be instability? Yes. Will there be some issues? Yes. But I don't see it more than what's happening now.
Thank you, Sam. The gentleman here.
Yes, staying sort of on the political front, some analysts have written in the United States that India has built up a number of consulates all around Afghanistan. I haven't been to Afghanistan in 40 years, so I don't know, but the notion being that they're preparing sort of a network to protect against Pakistan. The question is that, I don't know, first of all, do you think that that's happening? The second question is, Pakistan and Kashmir goes on, and it's not a big deal, and it is a big deal. Is there any possibility that Pakistan is going to change? I think the ISI is the government at this point in time. I believe there are some elections, but does it matter who wins? Are these
pretty bad guys. They're going to be there forever. And if so, obviously you're not going to get anything happening in Kashmir. I wish you could just make it into a free state. But would that calm things down between India and Pakistan? What a waste of money and time and energy and lives on this whole thing.
I mean, look, I don't know. I'm not close enough to the situation in Afghanistan, so someone else may want to comment. I think a little bit what Manjeet said. To some extent, there's a status quo with Pakistan right now on the nuclear side. I think there's a little bit of a standoff, status quo, and I think no one really wants and expects kind of what I'd say conflict, because it's going to be very costly to India, economic growth. Pakistan is certainly in a fiscally, it can't afford. You can't afford it. Can't afford a war. There was a panelist. There's a global risk panel here, which was very good on Monday, which I saw. And I think there were some good comments around the issue. But I think when I look at the risk of that issue in India, and looking at India, I worry less about that as a tail risk versus the practical aspects of how does the country grow on the infrastructure issues, etc., versus the other EM jurisdictions in the world, where I think you've got, whether it's Syria, or you have Southeast Asia concerns, or whether you have concerns around Ukraine, there's a lot else, more worrisome in some ways than the Pakistan issue in some ways today.
And I would just add to what Sanjay said. I can't add as to whether there are consulates in Afghanistan in different places or not. But you can rest assured that both countries have very good spy networks against the other. And that has existed since 1947. So whether there are explicit consulates or not, I'm sure they are both following, and that Afghanistan is of great interest to both countries.
And by the way, I don't know if anybody's been to an Indian consulate anywhere. Anybody's had the good fortune or the misfortune, I should say. Because if you have, you realize it's a very bad DMV spot. So nothing untoward can happen because they take 4-hour tea breaks. That's the point.
And talking about that, there was once a former CEO of ICICI, the large bank, who once said that the bureaucracy is such that if there are certain sectors which have to be delicensed, you need a license to show that it is going to be delicensed before you'll be allowed to set it up without a license.
I mean, I was just going to just add directly on Afghanistan. I mean, India clearly has a strategic interest in having good relations with Afghanistan, and it is part of the containment of Pakistan and the spread of really what India is concerned about is terror into India. So if they're distracted in other places, it's good, because we don't want another incident like the Bombay attack. That is clearly what is the big concern. War with Pakistan at this stage is a distant possibility. It's in no one's interest, and no one's really looking at that anymore. And Kashmir continues on the way it was. Status quo is maintained. There are elections there. The people vote. It's pretty stable.
Thank you, Manjeet. I'd like to shift it over. Perhaps if you can, we'll go to you. I want to make sure we cover an economic subject as well. And Sanjay, you have been discussing for a while the tapering and the impact. And the reason is that we had a huge crisis in July, August of 2013 after the Bernanke speech suggesting taper. The Indian rupee, which was in the 50s with respect to the US dollar, almost hit 70 within a matter of weeks. There was immense capital flight. When investors are looking to when to go into India, should they wait for another big cyclone, hurricane to hit before they go in? What happens with the tapering?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I'd say, I guess, can't remember 2 years ago, we were on a panel. Raghuram Rajan was on this panel. And he was by far the smartest person on this panel. And it was clear at the time he was the smartest person. And I think the government, certainly the Congress, did one good thing, which was bringing him in the summer. And it was amazing because it was all a little bit of a meltdown at the beginning of the summer in May when there was this talk of tapering and all of the EM economies just plummeted. The rupee went from 45 to 60, and it was a crisis. And he came in and he calmed the markets. He really in some ways kind of tried to do the right thing on a macro basis. And I think he's actually having him in place. The question is, does he stay on? So that's a big risk, I think, for the economy, and because he is it's like Janet Yellen, and with a Congress that's dysfunctional. So it's the same, parallel. If you have a good Fed governor, a central bank governor, it's really helpful for the economy. At the end of the day, I think India's external borrowing is at 20% of GDP. Maybe it's slightly higher now. Sam probably knows the stats better than me, but it's not upside down and it does have a current account deficit, but I think there are enough reserves, to manage the deficit for a few years. So I think from a tapering point of view, and I think the maturity of India's external debt is 9 years, and it's mainly rupees. It doesn't borrow in dollars, so the government is not that leveraged to some extent, and there is savings. So I think from a fiscal point of view, I think tapering it's actually the thing you don't worry about. It's the on-the-ground issues that you worry. I think that's the biggest concern that you're hearing from all of us, and it's very hard. It's hard to run companies. It's hard to invest. I think if you de-bottleneck, projects at the micro level, that's going to have better impact than worrying, I think, on the external. But there's no doubt. Look, the external concerns around tapering might impact the public markets, because public markets globally react to tapering all the time, or talk of tapering, timing of tapering, and I think the EM is no different. But I think from an actual macro point of view, I don't worry about it as much.
It's fair. I mean, you nailed it. In fact, if you can put slide 26 on, the taper, I think there's a short-term market impact for sure. This slide is very interesting. It talks about what happened since the governor came in. And one of the things what happened last year during the taper, the then RBI governor comes out and states, we don't defend the currency, which frankly is one of the strangest things I've ever heard from a central bank or anywhere in the world, because usually say, hey, we want currency to be stable. What that meant was massive shorts were opened up. You had the biggest shorts in the currency we've ever seen. Since the new governor came in, India has been an incredible performer in the markets, both in the market itself as far as the currency, and the currency is now recovered to 60 level. And if you go to slide 28, please, it shows what Sanjay was referring to, that external debt is actually very low in India. And this is a slide that's sometimes fun to talk with investors, that if you look at it, debt of GDP and external debt, it's actually very low. So you might have the short-term flow issues that people worry about, and this is really more market-oriented, but medium-term, long-term, we don't think there's a problem. And the Indian investor himself or herself, the economy itself is actually so unlevered. So if you look at it, 85% of housing is bought with cash. Only 15% of housing is more, they have mortgages. So there's actually reasonable savings. What you really need is, you need an administrative regime that can take some of that bureaucracy out and create an environment that you're not guessing what's your tax rate next 3 months from now.
Sam, that's a good segue to what might happen. Everybody talks about removing bureaucracy, Narendra Modi, the new Prime Minister, being able to achieve it. The stumbling block, the headwind, are the so-called three women of Indian politics. And one is Jayalalitha in the south, Mayawati in the state of Uttar Pradesh, very important state, the biggest state, and Mamata Banerjee out of West Bengal. Each one of them has said they would want to be Prime Minister. They are not capable of becoming Prime Minister, but they have the ability to screw up the national system. What happens when you have a hung parliament? He's a Prime Minister without enough support, and you have many of these economic reforms which we want to take place just don't happen.
Right.
Any one of those? Manjit?
I think that this time we are going to be close enough that it won't be a hung parliament. I think that with just a few allies, he will form the government. This time, it's anywhere 220 to 240, depending on which one of these bookies you look at. And they're pretty good. They're better than the exit polls. They're pretty reliable in India. So if he gets up, into that level, then it's a simple thing to form a majority, and they will be able to enact policies.
Thank you. Good.
Again, you wait May 16th. So as an investor, don't worry about why take the country risk for 2.5 weeks, and see what the dispensation is. My view is, if they are if they don't have a reasonable majority, that's a nightmare scenario. I think you will have
That,
mixed
there's,
issues.
there's actually slide 16 quickly, because it's
Yeah.
just, it is quite, no, sorry, slide 17. 17. It shows you, if we have the slide, that every poll has been wrong in the last three. And so to Manjeet's point, if you actually look at this, in 1999, people thought Congress was going to win. The black dot is actually what the outcome was. But it's getting better, so I wouldn't rely on the bookies.
Yeah.
The gentleman, second row from the back, you had a question.
Yes, I do. Or just two comments, question. And my experience with India goes back to the early 60s when I served in the
Could you
foreign-
keep the microphone? We can't hear you.
Yeah. My experience in India goes back to the early 60s when I was a Foreign Service officer in New Delhi, and I followed the country closely since. And two things that haven't been mentioned that I would appreciate the panel's comments on are these. One, in my experience, serious issues with regard to corruption at all levels of the government, from the local to Delhi. And the second one is, although obviously India has the common law system, and I am a recovering Wall Street lawyer, the court system is somewhat of a nightmare also in terms of having to deal with it. So stayed away from
excellent
both.
question.
It's a great,
Thank you.
it's a great question. I'd say, look, on the corruption front, I think that's real. I mean, it's a real issue. Coming back to the question of being able to run a business on the ground and the levels of payments you got to make. Look, in the new world, technology, education, some of these new markets and industries, there is less. Startups, young companies. Look, it is possible to probably manage a business today relative to the 60s and 70s, without kind of getting sucked into that corruption network. But there's lots of regulation that you have to deal with. And the question is, will Modi try to stamp it out? He's actually quite, in some ways, and others may want to comment, he's not viewed as a corrupt guy. That's huge. Sonia is viewed as, like Putin, and like these people who've been in power, as very corrupt. So I think you have a little bit of a shift that the person who's coming into power is not viewed actually, generally as someone who actually is a corrupt person. So I think if he can drive that may change. And so I don't know if others want to comment on
I
it.
think structurally corruption is just a complete byproduct of multiple levels of red tape. So as long as you have somebody with discretion, that discretion can be bought. And in essence, they want it to be bought, otherwise they don't approve. So and what Sanjay says is absolutely right. So they're the sort of like the newer businesses, and in IT is definitely one of them, and so on. And you go along that, where really there are not that many regulations. There really is no corruption. Because you don't have a rent-seeking. Point is that you don't have that extent of that rent seekers that just sit in there, the mandarins, which you have to deal with. So part of it is removing some of those barriers.
But having run a broadcast business in India, you don't have to be corrupt. And I certainly would not tolerate any corruption, because I'm not going to go to jail for Sony. I mean, it's not in my interest to be corrupt. And what one of my Indian counterparts said to me, which was very true, he said, "So how do you manage without paying anyone off?" I said, "We just wait." And he says, "So you're willing to build that inefficiency into your system?" I said, "It's the cost of doing business." So I may not get an approval as fast as someone else, but I sure get them over time.
Yeah.
So it's just a question of speed. Corruption is to speed up the process in many cases, and there's no reason for businesses to do that necessarily.
That's an excellent point, Manjeet.
I was going to talk about the court system. Look, there's China, India. I mean, China has no rule of law. India has a rule of law, but it takes, if you get caught in the courts, you're going to be there for a long time. So which would you rather have? So we'd rather take India any day, because there are systems. I think certainly in things that we look at, credit, we actually think there's been a change over the last decade around enforcement, because I think the banks in particular got together and said, it's crazy, we can't do anything if someone doesn't pay us back. And so they created an out-of-court mechanism to enforce on people who are defaulters. And I'd say that out-of-court mechanism is actually made India a reasonable place to do credit. We're a big global credit investor, so we wouldn't do credit in China, but we might do it in India. And I actually tell people, actually, India has a better system today than France. Okay, being a creditor in France and being in the court system in France, I run our business in Europe, is probably one of the worst, most inefficient places to be a creditor in. If you end up in the French court system, so oddly, obviously, the U.S. is the most efficient. I think France is probably one of those European jurisdictions. So lots of people do invest in credit in France, but they just don't think about enforcement. India is kind of in between. So that on certain asset classes and on a micro level, it's gotten better. But yeah, other cases you could be in courts for a long time.
Just a little statistic on the legal system, and I look at it, I view that as a part of the infrastructure. But 85% of lawsuits in India have either the state or the federal government as one of the parties. So it actually, believe it or not, it's an offshoot of the bureaucracy too, because you actually have contradicting laws. So you have to sue the government or they sue you. 85% of legal cases, and those are the things that clog down the system. Yeah. So it all eventually comes down to this whole idea that does the government have to have a finger in every decision you make as a individual businessman or a citizen, and that's where I think if that doesn't change, we can talk about many other things, but things will not change.
Let me make one point in addition to what Sanjay said about corruption. Narendra Modi has made a big deal of the fact he does not have a family. He does not have to be corrupt, in addition to the record he has of a clean and efficient administration in the state of Gujarat. Corruption often starts at the very top. Yeah. If you're corrupt yourself, you're not going to be able to ask your subordinates not to be corrupt because they know you are corrupt to begin with. And so one of the positives is going to be that he will have the moral authority to be able to enforce it, which again, none of the prime ministers, perhaps Jawaharlal Nehru was an exception, but anybody after that, it has been very tricky in terms of enforcement. It has got consistently worse with every prime minister. And Masood Sohaili in the second row. You had a question. Masood, if you'll wait for the microphone.
There's been a lot of discussion about the concerns relating to India and the issues of healthcare, education, infrastructure. It seems, though, with the evolving technology and the demographics in India, that what role do you see technology really playing as a way to really jumpstart and deal with a lot of these issues in a much quicker fashion than you normally expect for a country that size, given the demographics and given what's happening in technology?
That's a great question. There are more Indians on Twitter today than Americans. There are more Indians on Facebook today than Americans. And this is only 20% of the population has any kind of internet access. What's really interesting about this election especially, it's really being fought on social media. So if somebody goes out and makes a absurd statement, which every Indian politician does every day, there's a Twitter war. And by the way, that Twitter war makes the evening television. So what's happened is, and this is where I do, this is the reason I say this is a very interesting election, is if you look at least the initial opinion polls and so on, young people are voting across religious, ethnic, regional, and caste lines. So because they want development, so they see what people are doing in LA or New York. So I think technology is going to be a huge component of how the development happens. And as investors, we see actually very interesting opportunities across the board because of that. But technology is going to be very important across the board.
You have people like Nandan Nilekani, who's the founder of Infosys, who's actually getting involved. He got involved at the government level to try to drive the whole system of IDing, creating technology globally through the rural environment. So I think you will have, given the diaspora that's focused, and I think there's a new group of people who want to be more involved than they were in the past, decades. And look, my hope is I think it's going to be helpful.
So the biggest, I think, change is going to come in the spread of information through the internet. So right now there are 174 million internet connections, roughly, of which 24 million are wired and the rest are wireless. About 3% of them are about 4+ Mbps, which means that they can stream video, but the rest can't. That all will change very rapidly because the country is digitizing, and so you'll have cable modems in every home. You'll also have 4G come in, and that spectrum will allow a much greater spread of information, knowledge, education, all those kinds of things are being planned. So you really can see that in the next 5-10 years, the private sector is taking a huge lead on this, and that should happen. So there should be a really tipping point in terms of that internet penetration, and smartphones in India are $50. So that's also a very big change.
And the point that Manjeet made, Masood, is also that when you have technology developing, it helps you get over bureaucracy and corruption to some extent. For instance, it can take years for you to get a landline telephone and lots of bribes to pay before you have your phone set in your office or home. But then now that the cell phones are around, they completely replaced it. You don't have to pay a bribe anymore. Indians haven't become more honest, but at least the technology helps change that. And the same thing the internet revolution can do to some extent.
Absolutely.
The gentleman at the very back.
Yeah. So I guess when you put all this together, where are your guys' favorite investment opportunities on a more specific level? Obviously not getting too specific in some cases, but could be a public stock or certain sectors within the public space or even on the private side.
Excellent question. If you didn't ask that, I was going to have that to be the concluding question, but we have about 5 minutes, so if we'll go down the line, Sam.
No, very quickly, I think Manjeet mentioned one, which is the digitizing of the cable systems and media. That's a phenomenal opportunity. And we've been investing in that for the last few years and actually building up our positions. Financial, I mean, if anything has to happen in India, the financials have to be a big part of it. And right now in India, really the banking system is the only financial system. There's a very tiny piece which is the financial services company. So there's a plethora of opportunities across the financial sector. And really, one of the things we sort of talked about, if you look at the actual the total outstanding loans in the banking system as percent of GDP, it's tiny. So till you have that financial expansion and the credit that's available to, in essence, everybody, you're not going to develop. So financials, we see great opportunity. Anything related to the consumer, products, services, tremendous opportunities. And again, infrastructure, although as you can understand, there's a lot of hair on that ball, but if one does see in 6 months or a year progress on that, infrastructure will obviously be the biggest opportunity out there.
Sanjay?
Yeah, talking, following on what Sam said, the banking sector is a really interesting sector. I think one of the things that we focus on is, on the private side is actually credit. We think actually the development of credit markets is actually a really interesting phenomenon in India, and I think it will develop over the next few years. But besides that, the provision of credit. We like the lending businesses in India because you have a maturity. Sometimes entrepreneurs in India are a little wily. If you give them equity, they kind of think of it as free. They don't have to pay you back. And once in a while, if you have maturity coming back to the court, if you think you can enforce and get paid back, not all places, that's a key question in emerging markets. If you give someone a loan, are they going to pay you back? But we think actually the lending business, where the rates are very high, is actually equally as attractive as the equity business.
Manjeet?
Well, I think the business that I was in, the whole entertainment space is a huge opportunity in India, partly because it's a young population, incomes are rising, people are looking for new forms of entertainment. Television is only 60% penetrated in India, so there's a huge opportunity both in entertainment and specifically in the broadcast business to unleash large amounts of value in the near future.
Well, thank you all very much. You have been a great panel. Thank you for all your questions. Sometimes I worry about whether we have enough questions to spend the hour, but you kept it going. Thank you all, and have a good day.
Thank you.
Great.